Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Department of Justice Women's History Month event. I'm Allison Randall. I'm the Principal Deputy Director of the Office on Violence Against Women, and I am incredibly honored to be joined today by our Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, and our Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta. Well, this is a big week for us in the Office on Violence Against Women. Just a few days ago, the president signed the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization into law. So, Dag Monaco, could you share a few highlights from Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA 2022?
Well, absolutely. I'm just so happy to be with you, Allison. Thanks for convening all of us. And it's a real pleasure to be joined by the Associate Attorney General, a wonderful leader, part of the leadership team here in the department. So yes, the president signed VAWA 2022, and I, along with the Attorney General and the Associate Attorney General, were lucky enough to be in the White House in the East Room when the president had an event to commemorate that wonderful passage and reauthorization of really, really important legislation. Look, the legislation does a number of things, but most importantly, I think it reauthorizes some critical programs administered first and foremost by your terrific office and the wonderful people who work at OVW. These are really important programs to do everything from providing important support and services to survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, for training for law enforcement to understand how to approach these crimes and these situations in a trauma-informed way, for critical steps like reducing the rape kit backlog in this current day and age, the fact that we still have a significant backlog in important forensic examinations to help hold perpetrators accountable and have closure for victims and survivors. So, and then it does important things to advance new approaches and provide new authorities, things like restoring special domestic violence criminal jurisdictions for our tribal law enforcement partners and tribal communities, so that tribal law enforcement can hold accountable non-native individuals who are perpetrators of domestic violence and sexual violence. So it does a host of things, and critically, I think, shines, again, a spotlight on the importance of these programs and the great work of your office.
Thanks so much. Associate AG Gupta, what about you?
Oh, Vanita, you're on mute.
You would think after all this time that I would know how to operate my machine, but here we are. Let me thank the Deputy Attorney General for her leadership on VAWA. She's been, as everyone knows or should know, kind of a pioneer working in the Senate back when there wasn't a Violence Against Women's Act, and she's been really steadfast in her commitment to seeing the promise of VAWA become a reality, but also into this reauthorization. And then Allison, of course, as the Deputy Attorney General said, OVW is really the anchor for this work and how we are going to implement VAWA moving forward. But all of the work that you and your team did, I think, is really, we should be lifting this up. I'm glad we're lifting this up as part of Women's History Month. It's going to have a huge impact. One thing I think that the AG and the Deputy AG and I were so taken by when the president did this event last week was that he talked about how VAWA is not just a law. It's not just about changing the law. It's really about changing the culture. And there's no question that VAWA has played exactly that role. All of us remember a time when there was just very little talk and exposure about the problems of gender-based violence. And while we know we still have a lot of work to do, I think there's no question that some of that culture change has really been incredibly impactful and important for our work to end gender-based violence in this country. Some of the things outside of what the Deputy Attorney General mentioned as being important developments on this reauthorization, I think, are that also VAWA provides critical support for legal services funding and trauma-informed law enforcement responses. And this is part of the work that we need to do to support organizations around the country that are providing victim services. And one of the new developments of this new VAWA, newly reauthorized, I should say, is that it's actually expanding and authorizing programs to reach more people in this country, provide greater access to survivors that are in rural areas, survivors that require culturally specific services like language assistance, LGBTQ survivors, survivors with disabilities, immigrant survivors, older adults, survivors who are who we need to reach and who may be harder to reach in this country. And I think that the ways in which VAWA is expanding that reach is incredibly important. We want to make sure that the law is actually able to reach anyone who may be at risk of victimization, and this bolstering of support for culturally specific programs, I think, is an important development.
Thank you. We're so excited about all of these expansions. And you mentioned that the DAG worked on that original Violence Against Women Act passed in 1994. So DAG Monaco, we'd love to hear more of your thoughts. You were recently the highest ranking Biden administration official to testify before Congress about reauthorization. Reflecting on this, why is VAWA reauthorization still so important today?
Well, thanks so much, Allison, and I guess I should thank Vanita for taking me down memory lane. It's hard to believe nearly 30 years ago, and I'm kind of caught up short saying that, that it was nearly 30 years ago. I was a young staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff when the chairman was then Senator Joseph R. Biden, Jr., and this was in the period from 1992 to 1994. Before I ever went to law school, actually, and in fact, it was that experience and working on the Violence Against Women Act that actually gave me the bug, if you will, to go to law school and to go gain the skills so I could come back and work on these issues at the intersection of law and public policy and on criminal justice issues. And so, that experience was made really crystal clear to me what you could do to really change the culture. To Vanita's point, or really the president's point that he made at the ceremony last week, he was quite right that the importance of this legislation, both back in 1994, when it was ultimately signed by then President Clinton, and today, when it was reauthorized, the importance is influencing the culture, changing the culture. So at the beginning, in 1992, when I was a young staffer working on the original bill, what I did is I actually got kind of a firsthand account of what our law enforcement and criminal justice system wasn't doing. And what it wasn't doing is recognizing that the same level of crime, aggravated assault, battery, committed by somebody who knew the woman wasn't being taken seriously with the same level of seriousness, and wasn't in often instances being reported or being prosecuted as crimes that were committed amongst strangers. And what we did was I literally called around to domestic violence shelters and then called battered women's shelters to say, what reports are you getting? And then talking to local prosecutors and local police departments to compare, are you guys prosecuting these cases? And too often what we found is that they weren't. And so we did some real kind of basic research to point out how these crimes were not being taken seriously. And that was the critical importance of the first generation of VAWA in 1994. And then through successive reauthorizations, as Vanita and you have pointed out, we've been able to update and improve the law and reach more people who need to be reached. So, for example, rural communities, if somebody is the victim of rape or sexual assault and is 20, 30, 40, 50 miles away from the type of forensic examination that they might need, medical examination they might need to hold their perpetrator accountable, how do we make sure we're matching those services in rural communities so we can provide those services, so we can hold those perpetrators accountable? So those types of services are only more important now, and we need to reach more and more people and recognize the gaps and fill them.
Thanks. At that amazing event with the president, the loudest cheers were, in excitement about the expanded restoration of tribal jurisdiction over certain offenses committed on tribal lands. And you mentioned this before, and I know that your testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee really highlighted the importance of these provisions. Can you tell us a little more about what VAWA reauthorization will do for tribal communities?
Sure. And it's interesting you mentioned I had the privilege of testifying back in October before the Senate Judiciary Committee to push reauthorization. And it was interesting. It was kind of a coming home, if you will. I testified in this exact same hearing room that I was a young Senate staffer in, listening to the first set of hearings about violence against women, and to advance the first version of the bill in 1992, 93, and 94. And what was interesting is, back nearly 30 years ago, we were talking about the need for a Violence Against Women Act, but we weren't talking about the needs in tribal communities. We didn't really see the future, as it were. And unfortunately today, what we do know is painfully, Native women experience a shocking and unacceptable level of rape, domestic violence, sexual assault. And often research shows that those crimes are being committed by non-Native partners. And so what the VAWA 2022 does is restores what's called special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction, allowing tribal law enforcement and tribal communities to hold accountable non-Native perpetrators of these crimes. And what also VAWA 2022 does is it expands and provides a pilot for this same type of jurisdiction for Alaska Native villages. So again, we have to constantly refine and renew our commitment here. And quite frankly, we have to make sure we're constantly improving it. And that's what VAWA 2022 does.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned was the importance of, responding to domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking as the serious violent crimes that they are. And Associate Attorney General Gupta, these are crimes that have a really devastating impact, not just on survivors, but also on their communities. So how can the department employ VAWA as a tool for reducing violent crime and promoting public safety?
Yeah, I think it's important that we all continue to make sure that that the public at large understands that these types of crimes are indeed need to be addressed through any effort and strategy to combat violent crime. And VAWA gives the Justice Department really significant tools in this regard. It includes programs that fund police and prosecution and courts in every state and territory. And the specialized responses that VAWA actually makes possible lead to better evidence collection and more successful prosecutions. We also know that law enforcement isn't able to do this alone. And so VAWA funds really a coordinated community response around the country that brings together all parts of the criminal justice system, along with victim service providers, people who work in housing and healthcare, child protective services, and the like, to allow for a more coordinated approach, which will ensure that we are able to meet survivors and have a trauma-informed approach with survivors. But it's also going to lead to better outcomes for survivors, their families, and frankly, for public safety for all of our communities. Another thing that VAWA does is it enhances our efforts to reduce homicides by enforcing federal and state firearms laws. There's a pretty kind of gripping amount of research that shows that offenders with domestic violence in their past pose a high risk of homicide. Perpetrators of domestic violence with a gun in the home are 5 times more likely to kill their partners than those without easy access to a gun. So making sure that our existing firearm laws are enforced is an important part of keeping people safe. There's also 2 specific programs that the Justice Department has been involved in to combat domestic violence and sexual assault, one of which I was honored to be able to roll out with you, Allison, just last month. It's LETAC, which is a one-stop shop for law enforcement agencies to request training and technical assistance in responding to, investigating, and prosecuting cases involving violence against women crimes. And this is going to enable law enforcement to do what they can to combat DV with trauma-informed responses. We also have DV Risk. It's a national resource center to help communities choose domestic violence homicide reduction strategies that are comprehensive and equitable and meet the unique needs of any particular jurisdiction. So there's a lot of different ways in which VAWA really helps us combat violent crime with specific targeted approaches that I hope that are really going to be able to meet the populations that VAWA is intended for and to maintain public safety in all of our communities.
Well, and of course, we can't end gender-based violence without also promoting gender equity and doing it in an intersectional way that includes racial equity and addressing multiple forms of oppression. It's the Violence Against Women Act alone isn't the solution. So how does the department's work promote that broader gender equity and racial equity?
Yeah, I mean, the Justice Department is, a leading participant, a central participant in a government-wide strategy to advance gender equity, as well as we are actively implementing the executive order on advancing racial equity. I think VAWA very much is a part of kind of that effort in terms of the expanded services and support that will go to victims that are harder to reach in rural communities, as I said, older Americans, LGBTQ Americans, making sure we have culturally specific programs and the like. And so it does fit within this broader fabric of our work to ensure that our laws are equally enforced. The Justice Department's mission is equal justice under law. And a lot of you all across the department are doing really important and creative work to prevent gender-based violence. And you're working in a whole bunch of different areas in terms of ensuring open access to housing and employment and equal opportunity enforcement of our civil rights laws. Of course, OVW and OJP and the Civil Rights Division are now also leading the development it's an interagency effort on the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. And the department is doing so much broader work around access to justice issues that I think speak to the broader effort to ensure both gender and racial equity and to make sure that the types of services and programs that we are deploying to fight violent crime, that all victims or everyone at risk is able to benefit from them.
That's fantastic. It's such exciting work, and it's a really amazing time to be here at the department. While we're on the topic of gender equity and empowerment, many women contribute to the department at all levels. And I can't describe how exciting it is to have two of the three members of DOJ's most senior leadership team as women. So Dag Monaco, your DOJ career began over 20 years ago as counsel to Attorney General Janet Reno, the first woman to serve as Attorney General, and you were the first woman to lead the National Security Division. So reflecting on that, what advice would you give to women who are just starting their careers with the department?
Well, look, I think, Allison, some of the advice I would give is I would give to young men in the department as well. But I think it's particularly important for young women, and I think it's important as part of Women's History Month to remind ourselves that there are basically no limits on what you can do and what you can envision for yourself. I think it wasn't always thus that that young women could see themselves in virtually any career path. But I think I would encourage young women to constantly be reminded that there are no limits on the type of experience and career path you can pursue. And part of that is being able to see yourself in the role that you want to have. So being able to see women and it was very informative for me. I mentioned my Senate, my early days pre-law school working in the Senate. I think part of what led me to want to go to law school and come back and work on these issues was the fact that when I worked in the Senate, my three bosses, I was a baby staffer, were all women. And I could see myself, my future self, in them. And that was really, really important. The second thing I would say is early on, particularly early on in your career, it is much more important who you are working for than what you are working on. I often get questions from folks like, well, I'm really interested in working on X issue. And that's terrific, and you should follow your passion. But early on, you really should be looking for experiences where you're working for and with people that you're going to learn from and that you can model yourself after. And then lastly, I would say be open to possibilities. As some of you may know, in the Obama administration, I spent the second term of the Obama administration in the White House as the President's Homeland Security Advisor. If you had told me as a baby lawyer that I was going to be doing that one day, I would have said you were nuts. So you just got to be open to the possibilities.
Fantastic. Well, and, Associate Attorney General Gupta, you served as head of the DOJ Civil Rights Division and, of course, have returned as our Associate AG. What's your advice for folks who are just starting out at DOJ?
I'm just taking notes from what Lisa just said to make sure that I'm implementing but she's absolutely right. Everything she said resonates pretty deeply. I would just encourage, younger attorneys here to seek out mentors. And if you're an experienced attorney here, to be a mentor. I think that, both in terms of being able to see yourself and your kind of an understanding of career progression as a junior attorney here at the department or as a junior member of a junior employee or staffer. I just think it's really important that people have mentors who can provide guidance, who can be sounding boards, who can understand and bring the experience that they have had here at the department to be brought to bear and provide guidance to younger lawyers. I have always found in my own career that the importance of mentorship has been invaluable to me. And I think when there are women in positions where they've had immense experience here at the department, to be able to share those learnings and reflections, I think is always important. But obviously mentorship requires that people be willing to offer themselves as mentors. And so to also, for those that are more experienced, to be able to lend a little bit of time to cultivate leadership across the department. This department is constantly energized by some of the brightest and most talented. And the hope is that we are able to bring people together, build out their skills, build out their aspirations, and as the deputy said, to make sure that they understand that there aren't limits except what may be in our own minds. And so to the extent we can dismantle some of those as we do the important work of law enforcement here at the Justice Department, I think that is incredibly important.
Thank you both for that great advice. I would just add that the department offers some really fantastic detail opportunities, and I would really encourage people to take advantage of that. That's how I and many other folks have advanced in our careers as well. Well, when I think about some of the things that help us advance or can hinder us in advancing in our career, I think about sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. Sexual harassment is something that impacts many women throughout our careers, and it often impedes us from advancing or from achieving our goals. Workplace sexual misconduct is all too common, but it's rarely reported. So Dag Monaco, can you tell us more about the work that DOJ is doing to combat sexual harassment?
Well, sure. Look, I take very, very seriously, as does Vanita, as does, of course, the Attorney General, first, our responsibility to our own workforce, okay? And their well-being, their safety, feeling respected and safe in the workplace is job one. And it's an exceptionally important responsibility that I feel acutely. And part of that responsibility is making sure we're doing everything we can to combat sexual harassment and misconduct in our own workplace. And to that end, I established a steering committee when I first came back to the department after I got confirmed last year, a steering committee to review the current policies and procedures that we have across the department in different components for addressing reports and handling reports of sexual harassment and misconduct, and making sure that we've got consistency and are forward-leaning on those policies and procedures. And to that end, I want to thank the many, many folks who have participated in both the surveys and focus groups that the steering committee has been doing as a result of that work. So that's point one, making sure that we are doing everything we can to protect our own workforce. And then the other point is about holding ourselves accountable. And to that end, we have to make sure our own house is in order. Unfortunately, we have instances where we've got, and this is publicly, it's been made public, that we've got a number of cases in the Bureau of Prisons, where documented cases that are ongoing, where members of the Bureau of Prisons have been charged with misconduct, and these are ongoing cases, which I've talked to U.S. attorneys' offices about, talked to the Inspector General about. We cannot do our job if we're not holding our own accountable for abusing a position of trust, whether it's here in the workplace, whether it's in Bureau of Prisons facilities, or regardless of where it occurs. So we have to make sure that we are walking the walk and holding our own accountable. And then lastly, providing services and training to enable those who we issue grants to make sure that they are have their own policies and procedures in place to address these issues. And I know OVW does exactly that and funds those types of programs for grantees. So for that, I applaud, as so much else, the work of OVW.
Well, thank you. And for anyone who's interested, we fund workplacesrespond.org, and it has resources for federal employers as well as the private sector. And I know I and my staff feel so proud to work at a department that's taking sexual assault and sexual harassment so seriously and profoundly addressing the issues of domestic violence and sexual assault. Well, as a last reflection, it's been tough with the pandemic, and tough on so many women who are juggling caregiving and incredible work here at the department and elsewhere. And this year's Women's History Month theme recognizes that ceaseless work of caregivers and of frontline workers during the pandemic. What would both of you like to share with those frontline workers here at the department and elsewhere who have worked so hard? Dag Monaco?
Well, first, I guess I'd say a profound thank you for both the vigilance, the endurance, the commitment to so many who have not been able to skip a beat when it comes to being on the front lines, whether it's in a national security position that did not afford you the ability to stay, to work from home, having to come in every day throughout the pandemic, and all that entailed. Whether it's the many, many people who, throughout the course of the pandemic, had to adjust and juggle so many different commitments and responsibilities, from caregiving for loved ones, for changing their own circumstance as a result of the pandemic. It has been a profound strain for so many in our workforce. And then, of course, our unique responsibility as a law enforcement agency, and having so many first responders and law enforcement personnel who have had to shoulder so much throughout the pandemic. Of course, going in and doing their job under tremendous strain and having so much put at literally at their feet every day. We feel that acutely, both for our own law enforcement components and professionals who work every day to keep us safe, and of course all of our partners in state and local, tribal and territorial law enforcement. So profound thanks, and understanding that as we emerge from this and continue our work, knowing that we'll have to adjust as we go, focused on the science and focused on keeping our people safe.
Absolutely. And Associate AG Gupta, last thoughts?
Well, I think the deputy said everything as well as could possibly be said, which is just this enormous sense of gratitude for first responders. You know, when we think about what law enforcement was enduring and wasn't able to skip a beat, what domestic violence and sexual assault advocates and service providers were doing to not skip a beat. We all know that domestic violence and sexual assault didn't stop during COVID. I remember in March of 2020 when everything was shutting down and the courts were shutting down and programs and services were having to shut down, being really profoundly worried about what was going to happen to domestic violence and sexual assault survivors in particular. And we know research has shown that domestic violence increased during the pandemic. Shelters were really overwhelmed and needing to adapt weekly, sometimes monthly, about new protocols, but to be able to save lives and protect the most vulnerable among us. And our first responders just kept kind of persevering. Many contracted COVID. We lost first responders because in the line of duty, as they were seeking to keep some kind of continuum of services to keep people safe. And so, you know, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to those who, you know, did everything they could under the most unprecedented of circumstances, on top of a job that already demands so much of them every day. And so the hope is that we are emerging from this pandemic with services that are going to be even stronger, with VAWA that is going to expand those services, but also that are going to allow for first responders to be able to have the services they need as well, in order that, you know, it's had an enormous toll, and we need to make sure that we are also concerned about the kind of stresses that have been imposed on our first responders through this unprecedented period. So I think we're all in this together, but the bottom line is just that we all have an enormous debt of gratitude for our first responders.
Absolutely. Well, powerful words to end on. I want to thank you both, and thank you to everyone at DOJ who joined us. We are looking forward to continuing to work to address domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking every month of the year, and in partnering with all of you to make that happen. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.